Welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Mile series, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Professor Michael Mainelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, what Michael likes to call the world's coffee house, and how these might help us to tackle future global challenges. I'm Professor Tim Connell, Chairman of the Gresham Society and a Fellow of Gresham College here in the City of London, and I'm a liveryman as well of the Stationers' Company. I'll be convening this session today and moderating the questions and answers after today's lecture, so do please send your questions in. This is a plan for today, very brief introduction from me, then the keynote presentation from Laurie Edmonds and Vic Mazonas, and then we have about 20 minutes for questions afterwards. Now, today we have a really interesting topic, unlocking neurodiversity in insurance and investment. So I'm delighted to welcome today Laurie Edmonds and Vic Mazonas. Laurie, would you like to kick off and tell us something about yourself?
Thank you, Professor Tim. Yes, I'm Laurie Edmonds, long-standing insurance and investment sector person. Too long, some might argue. Particular specialism in pensions, and actually became a liveryman myself on the 1st of July.
Which company?
The insurers.
Ah, of course.
And
yes.
So that's me in a few words.
Right. And Vic, what about yourself?
Thank you very much. I'm Vic Mazonas. I'm autistic myself, so I come with the lived experience perspective of this, although I didn't know I was till I was in my 30s. So I also know what it's like before you know how to advocate for yourself. I worked in the insurance industry for about 7 years, and I'm just very passionate about sharing the information that we want to share today.
All right, well, that's a good start. So can you tell us more about unlocking neurodiversity and how this can be done in insurance and investment? Over to you.
Sure. Well, if I could have the first slide, please, Sasha. As I've just said, I've been an executive and chair of a number of insurance businesses over the years. In recent years, one of the major business issues which the businesses I've been working with has faced has been the difficulty of getting enough and the right sort of talent. I've also been a trustee of a school for autistic children for 20 years and have 2 dyslexic sons. So I've seen at first hand the difficulties of getting into employment for people with autism and other forms of neurodiversity. Measures vary, but even the most optimistic show that less than 1 in 3 autistic people are in employment, when the vast majority want to be in employment, and the vast majority can do a great job if given the chance. So, recognizing that there's a talent gap that needs filling, and underappreciated and underemployed talent in the industry in which I and my co-founder have worked all our lives, we set up GAIN to make the match between the industry's talent and the talent. We started GAIN about 5 years ago, focusing really on autism on a purely voluntary basis. GAIN became a formal entity 3 years ago, and we now have a small permanent staff of 4 people, including Vic. We're delighted at how our sector of the industry, often portrayed as rather uncaring, has seen the need to give neurodivergent people a better chance and the business benefit of doing so really clearly. We now have more than 40 major businesses in the sector giving us significant support, from Aviva to and most stages of the alphabet in between, and they're giving us financial support, not just words, and between them they employ more than a quarter of the 400,000 people who work in our sector. We believe we're on our way, therefore, to achieving our objective, which is a radical improvement in the employment prospects of neurodivergent people in the insurance, investment, and related sectors of financial services. And this is why we're so pleased to have this opportunity to talk to the broader city, because if we can do it in insurance and investment, then so can others. So, as you can see on the screen, there's some of the data about this, and some of the I'd like to look at that and at some of the benefits which recognizing the abilities and attributes of neurodivergent people can bring. As I said, there are different measures. Here's what the ONS survey in 2023 showed as the proportion of autistic people in employment. And even in employment, they're generally at a disadvantage regarding pay, the longevity in their role, whether or not they have a permanent role, or on 0 hours contracts. The number of autistic people on 0 hours contracts is much higher than the average. They're also most likely to be overqualified for the role they hold. So the problem about getting more autistic people into work is clear, but it's not just about autistic people, and it's not just about getting them into work. When we started GAIN, we were particularly focused on autistic people and the problems of getting them into work. But we very soon realized that the issues faced by autistic people are also very often indeed shared by people who are neurodivergent in other ways. ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, just to mention a few. Looking at them all, 1 in 7 in the population are neurodivergent. So this is not a marginal thing. We also found that the issues faced by neurodivergent people are very often as significant when they're in work as they are getting employed in the first place. Having a work environment where a neurodivergent person can do their best work is crucial and not difficult to achieve. So don't put people who find noise difficult to handle next to the photocopier. Do let those who need it have a permanent location rather than requiring them to hot desk every day. Small steps like this can let people who would otherwise mask their differences, which is proven to be highly stressful and have a really bad effect on productivity as a result, really do a much better job and be happier. The key thing is simply understanding that different people have different needs and may act differently. The role of line management is crucial, but senior management needs to set the atmosphere.
Very good.
Just having interview and appraisal processes which don't, almost by definition, but unintentionally make it more difficult for neurodivergent people to even get the chance to show their best side is not difficult to do. Simple measures like telling candidates what the interview questions are going to be in advance, who they will be seeing, can make a huge difference. Making the changes needed is more a question of attitude than it is of expense or difficult change. Looking, as the slide shows, at some of the different forms of neurodiversity and the attributes and advantages they can bring. Dyslexia, creative thinking, interpersonal skills, big picture thinking, ADHD, working under pressure, ability to multitask. It almost stands to just it's what it says on the tin. Autism, problem solving, analytical thinking. It's not just about the link between some forms of autism and data, although that's really important to our industry and every bit of financial services these days. It's not just about the Alan Turings of this world. One of our pet phrases is that neurodivergent people are great at the job from the post room to the boardroom. And the key thing is finding the match between the abilities and the role. And it can make a big difference if you're able to do it. If I could just have the next. Sorry, I ought to just mention that on the previous slide, we have made a match in our industry between the kind of roles we have in our industry, where we have talent shortages almost across the board, and the skills and abilities that neurodivergent people can bring in. And my final point before handing over to Vic, who will talk in much more depth than I can, is about the potential that realizing neurodivergent can bring. So JP Morgan, who are one of the leaders in this, along with some of our members, Legal and General, Zurich, QBE, making huge steps in the right direction, Aviva. But the JP Morgan study showed that autistic participants in their pilots were 48% faster and up to 92% more productive than neurotypical employees. Also had a high retention rate. So this isn't just a nice to do. Looking after autistic talent, making the workplace available and suitable for them is a straightforward business benefit, not just something to put in your CSR reports. I'll leave it there and pass over to Vic, who will talk in some more detail progress that's being made and possible. Over to you, Vic.
Thank you very much, Laurie. So as said before, I'm autistic myself. Like many people my age, I wasn't diagnosed as a child because in the 90s, people that presented autism the way I do generally didn't get picked for the diagnosis path. So I was an adult before I knew I was autistic. What this means is I've seen what it looks like before you know the right words to explain how you're feeling and who you are, before you know how to advocate for yourself. And I've also seen the impact it makes after that happens when you're in a workplace that is supportive. Even if the people around you aren't experts, haven't encountered this before, just having the right attitude can make a huge difference. Some of the things I want to talk about, though, is some of the why we're seeing this employment gap, some of the things underlying it, the impact that has on people, and then lead you into what we can do about it. Because it's one thing to tell you what the problem is, and it's another thing to actually leave you feeling like you can make a difference. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Now, there's a lot of words on screen, but don't worry, you'll be giving a copy of these afterwards. One of the things I like to showcase to illustrate where some of the core of this comes from is the old way of thinking about neurodiversity. For a very long time, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, various other neurodivergencies were only really seen through the lens of problems to be solved. And we do have our challenges as well as our strengths, but the pitfalls of looking at it only from that lens are really obvious in a somewhat recent study, not in the results of the study, but in the way that the people running the study demonstrated the data and what that illustrates about the thinking they had subconsciously in their minds. In this study, you had autistic and non-autistic participants who were given a range of scenarios. One particular scenario I want to talk about is they were asked whether they would support a morally bad cause in return for financial gain. Crucially, they were asked in two different settings. In a public setting where other people would know what they said, and in a private one where no one would know what decision they'd made. In the study, they found that the non-autistic participants would quite often say that they would not support the bad cause when they were in public. They said, no, that's morally wrong. I won't do that even though I'll benefit. But in private were more likely to actually say, actually, I will support that cause. I want to benefit from it. In contrast, the autistic participants were consistent regardless of the environment. If an autistic person said that they would not support a morally bad cause when they were in public, they still wouldn't support it in private either. But what the study concluded is that autistic people are inflexible when following a moral rule, even though immoral action can benefit themselves, and suffer an undue concern about the ill-gotten gains and the moral cost. There was a pathologizing response there, basically assuming that whatever the non-autistic group did would be the correct thing to do. And that led them to basically saying that having consistent morals is a sign of a deficit in thinking, which you can see immediately is almost amusing on its face, but it shows that there is this underlying thought process. And when everything you do is seen through that lens, is seen as a problem, everything you do gets questioned. It can have a really wide impact on how you're seen by the world, what opportunities are made available to you. Personally, I think especially in industries like insurance, where we are handling extremely sensitive data and very large sums of money, having people in your workplace whose morals are consistent and grounded in a deep personal sense, where they will not betray those personal morals even when they can get away with it, that's an asset in the insurance industry and elsewhere as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. As I said, the cost of the old way of thinking and the way the world currently works is quite broad. Laurie showed you some statistics earlier around the employment rates of autistic people, and also around the issues we face in the workplace in terms of longevity of employment, pay gaps, and things like that. One issue we do struggle with is a lot of the data out there is specific to autism. At Gain, we do our own surveys as well. We have our benchmark that we run for our client companies, and we also do an individual member survey on an annual basis that allows us to dive deeper into the topics of all of the neurodivergent community. We're doing more research as well to kind of get a broader spectrum. And I want to compare some of our data to some that we've seen elsewhere. The Vulnerability Experiences Quotient study in 2019 is one that I find particularly illustrating. It went into topics of the workplace, but it did go much more broadly than that. It looked at everything from childhood experiences through to adult personal lives and things like that. But to give you an example, 43% of autistic people said that they were signed off from work at least 2 months due to mental health, compared to 15% of non-autistic people. 48% of autistic respondents said that they had spent at least a year unemployed and seeking work. 73% said they'd left a role due to the environment or the demands put on them. 33% said they were regularly overlooked for promotions and contract renewals. 49% had left a role due to mistreatment by colleagues. And 54% had been bullied by someone in the workplace. Our own public benchmark, where we survey our member companies, showed that across the broader neurodiversity spectrum, 20% of neurodivergent respondents said they'd experienced or witnessed bullying and mistreatment in the workplace, compared to 7% of the neurotypical population. 32% of our neurodivergent respondents said that they'd left a workplace due to bullying. And when we asked people the kinds of barriers that they saw to access in the industry, we see trends around a lack of visible engagement by leadership that doesn't appear to be engaged with the fact that they have a diverse population of employees. We saw that there are inconsistent attitudes and understanding of adjustment policy applications between HR and line managers, that quite often the expectation of medical evidence and doctor's notes for even minor adjustments creates a really big access barrier. You have to remember that diagnosis can be a long process. A lot of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond are finding, as their children or grandchildren are being diagnosed, realizing they've been living their whole lives with this. And those people are going to take time to try and actually get access to diagnosis, if they can at all. There's also the issue of affordability. So that's another barrier people are facing on a regular basis. There are a lot of other issues that we found as well, and psychological safety is a very big part of this. In our individual member survey, we found that actually the companies who'd been working with us saw a really quite significant improvement in the well-being of their employees. 87.5% of the neurodivergent respondents to our individual member survey said that they were open to someone in the workplace about their neurodivergence, whether that was a line manager, their team, or the HR department. They also were much more likely to feel their company was inclusive and had been getting more inclusive. They were much more likely to feel safe with the idea of disclosing in the future. We did ask what barriers people do think exist to disclosing in the workplace. And the most common ones were fear that they won't get a fair chance at promotions and opportunities, worried about being excluded, worried about not being believed or having their disclosure discounted or doubted, worried about being patronized in the workplace, and worried that people will think they need more support than they actually do. So you can see that a lot of the fears people are having are actually very consistent with the measured experiences we're seeing. So these are not unrealistic things for people to feel anxious about. This means that creating a work environment that fosters a feeling of psychological safety. It fosters an understanding that whatever you bring to the workplace, whoever you are, that's okay and will be accepted, is really impactful and really important. If we could go to the next slide, please. So there are things that we can do in the workplace that are really quite, I would say, simple. As Laurie said before, very often it's not so much about very expensive adjustments as it is more an attitude shift. There are certain practical changes that can be made in the workplace in terms of things that might cost a little bit, but the costs are very small. Now, you have to remember as well, we're talking about neurodiversity. Even if we were just talking about autism, it would still be important to emphasize that we refer to a spectrum of neurodiversity because each individual person will have their own unique balance of strengths and support needs. This means that there's no universal set of just do these 3 things and everyone will be happy. You have to take each individual person as they come, which is where the attitude shift comes in. But some of the very common things that we might need adjusted include aspects of the sensory environment. Myself personally, for example, I find that light and sound can be very overwhelming for me. So an open plan office with a lot of busy things going on can be quite overwhelming. Some people might find that texture and smell can be overwhelming. So if your desk is close to the kitchen, or if the office chairs have got some kind of scratchy surface on them that's quite uncomfortable, those kind of things. We might need adjustments around social aspects of the workplace, around communication styles, around the interpretation of instructions, how training is given, learning styles and things like that. And I know there's a lot of debate going on about learning styles, but it is still very much the case that, to give you an example, autistic people are much more likely to need to ask clarifying questions and to need the wider context around a piece of information. This is something that I find very important myself, actually. If I'm just told, here's a task to do, here's the checklist of steps involved, I will need to check that checklist every time. I will forget steps, I will get confused, I will be unsure what to do if I come across a slightly unusual version of that task. If something is slightly changing, it can be a bit difficult for me to navigate, unless I'm given the opportunity during that training to ask, why are we doing this task? What is the purpose of it? What is the goal we're trying to achieve by doing it? What are the outcomes? What do things look like before they come to me? When I have that wider context and when I'm allowed to ask those clarifying questions, all of a sudden I can very innovatively figure out not only how to make those flexes to that particular task when something unusual comes up, but after a bit of practice, I'll be finding more efficient ways to do it and helping my colleagues to be even faster and better at it because I'll understand that wider picture. Predictability and control is another area. So, for example, hot desking can be overwhelming because you don't know where you're going to be sitting or what the environment will be like. Making sure that schedules are, where possible, not changed last minute. Making sure that deadlines and expectations are communicated clearly. I could go down the list further, but a thing you might be noticing as I'm just describing all of these adjustments is these are things that can help neurodivergent people, but they just sound like good practice in general when you think about it. And actually, we believe very strongly in using universal design principles for this because they really do benefit everyone. And if I could go to the next slide, please. So you may be familiar with the cut curb effect. It was described in 2017, and effectively, curb cuts on pavement were initially designed to improve accessibility for wheelchair users, but they benefit everyone because we all have times when navigating the street can be a bit more difficult for us. Whether you've got a buggy, whether you're using a mobility aid, visually impaired people have the bumps that are provided ahead of those cut curbs to show where they're available. Anybody who's using anything like a bicycle or skateboard, even just people who are carrying large and bulky things and maybe can't quite see where they're going as well, having that slope to step down rather than a sudden stop is much safer and much easier. And actually a lot of adjustments, especially the ones that we recommend for neurodivergent people, make the biggest difference when you adjust them across the board. I want to give you a couple of examples now just to show you the kinds of ways of thinking that work here. I said that one thing that can be really helpful for neurodivergent people is around scheduling and time management and preparation. So we often recommend that you give people the agenda for a meeting in advance. And more than that, that in the agenda, you have the points that are going to be covered, who's going to be speaking for that point, and what the goal is in that part of the agenda, what the outcome you're trying to achieve. So rather than just saying, we're having a meeting tomorrow to talk about the Jones report, you'll say, we're going to have a meeting tomorrow. The topic will be the Jones report. Bob is the one who's going to be presenting, and we need to work out, are we on schedule? How far behind are we? And who is going to take up this task and that task? And then what are we going to do to navigate that going further? That allows your neurodivergent employees to prepare for that meeting adequately mentally, to process the kind of information they're going to need, to be ready to speak, to be ready to contribute, and to understand the purpose. But everyone will get more out of that meeting because you've made that adjustment. So rather than just sending that agenda to the autistic or the neurodivergent employee, make that the norm in how you work. We say a similar thing during the interview process. A very common recommendation we make is to provide interview questions in advance so people have time to think about them. And a common refrain we hear is that might unfairly advantage or disadvantage some people who don't get that. To which the response is, make it the normal part of how you recruit people. For one thing, if you are using a standard set of questions where any of the less familiar questions, the ones that aren't preset, are built out of the responses you're receiving from the people, you're going to have a much more consistent way of measuring recruitment processes in general, because you can get a consistent understanding of those initial questions from every candidate. And then the deeper conversation is more around their own responses, around their own skills, around how they present the data. It means that nobody is disadvantaged by not getting access to that information, but the neurodivergent people who need processing time don't have to worry that in the interview you're going to ask them a question and then you're going to watch them sit there for a minute as we mentally process and try to figure out what you meant. So you're lowering a barrier for one group without impacting negatively anybody else. The truth is that when you're looking at neurodivergence in the workplace, it really is about flexibility of thinking, about thinking, this person has said this is a struggle for them. How can I help them? But how can I help everyone? Who else might be impacted by this? Rather than just make an adjustment for one person, remove the need for the adjustment. In meetings, for example, if you let everyone know during a remote meeting online, which all of us are having all the time these days, that people who want to can be off camera in case they're feeling Zoom fatigue, as it got called. They don't have to speak if they don't want to. If they don't think of anything to add during the meeting, but afterwards they suddenly realize they have ideas, contribute them afterwards. You don't lose any of that good information. And what you gain is that confidence and feeling of belonging and psychological safety that reduces a lot of the barriers we mentioned, the measured impact of that fear in the workplace. I could frankly talk for hours about the number of individual ones you could do, and I probably shouldn't, so I will stop talking about those now. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an understanding of the kinds of things you can do. And I will hand over to Professor Tim again. I believe you are
You're muted, Tim.
Yes, let's try that again. Just to say, the slides are very, very useful, and for our viewers, these will be available subsequently online. The thing that struck me most was you've outlined an awful lot of what I would hope was good practice for everybody, and simply emphasizing that for people with a particular requirement, having things like a clear-cut agenda is more important for them, but actually I would have said totally necessary for everybody else. And I'm just thinking, and you mentioned Zoom fatigue, and I have to nod sagely at that point. I quite understand what you mean. Curiously enough, I don't know if it's worth mentioning at this point, I put in a very simple question into Google, what is neurodiversity? I got a very good message back from Harvard Health, which again viewers might like to look up in. And there's a very useful checklist. How can employers make their workplaces more neurodiversity friendly? And again, there are a dozen points. and I would say almost all of those could almost apply to a well-run office. And it's quite a useful checklist, especially for newer managers or people setting up a new section, because all of it sounded only too familiar. Now, on to questions. Sandrinian has come in with an interesting question about whether there have been improvements in the understanding of neurodiversity in the workplace, particularly in recent years, and what can be done to make neurodivergent people feel more comfortable when disclosing this to their employer. So you've got two questions there, really.
Vic, I
I'm
think that's one for you.
really happy to go with those. So in terms of improvements, there have been some. Now, this is not industry wide, and I wouldn't say it's even one industry can consistently say they're improving, but we are starting to see the impact. I would say that more companies are willing to have the conversation, certainly. I'm seeing a lot more openness to vulnerability among organizations, talking not only about the value of neurodiversity, but an awareness of what they're not doing yet and what they need to change. That's been a really gratifying thing to see. Um, Most exciting, our own data, because we, like I say, we survey on a regular basis, both our individual members who are, to clarify, neurodivergent people both within the companies that we work with and elsewhere in the industry, people working in other companies as well. And what we've seen is that the companies that are committing to making a change on this are seeing a measurable impact. We're seeing people being more willing to disclose and have those vulnerable conversations. We're seeing a measured increase in the amount of reported psychological safety. We're seeing that line managers are much more willing and open to offering a wide variety of adjustments and making things easier for their colleagues. We do see a certain amount of, I would say, the Dunning-Kruger effect is in play, where at the very early start of the journey, people get very confident very quickly, and then suddenly it dips a bit as they realize how much more there is to learn. But we're starting to see people come up the other side of that curve now as well, which is really exciting. Sorry, there were two questions there, wasn't there? What was the second part? I'm sorry.
Yeah, what can be done to make neurodivergent people more comfortable when disclosing this to their employer? Is there a certain element of concern or worry about what the reaction might be?
There really is. And I have to say, in all honesty, one of the most impactful things I've seen is honesty and vulnerability from leadership. I cannot emphasize enough how big an impact the way that leaders in a company can make a difference here, whether that is somebody who's very senior and leading across the board or somebody who's leading a team. The fact is that everyone has their own unique mind of their own unique strengths and their own unique support needs. But some people's minds more naturally suit the standard map of the world that we're living in, while others don't. Somebody I think very highly of, Atif Chowdhury of Diversity and Ability, has said that we're all neurodiverse, but we're not all marginalized because of it. So one of the ways that you can think about that is show vulnerability about your own needs. If you as a leader are willing to say, I'm feeling really overwhelmed because I've had 6 meetings today back to back. So I apologize. I'm going to need to be off camera for this meeting. I might need to cut this short and we'll follow up afterwards. If you're willing to say that as somebody in that senior position, that shows everyone else that this is a normal way to feel in the workplace, that is acceptable, and gives people a framework of how they can advocate for themselves as well. So that is where I would say.
Could I just absolutely. There are one or two structural things that you can do too. Line management, particularly first line management, are key. They are very often task driven and heavily measured on output of simple things. Getting line management, that first line management, to do the sort of things Vic's described is crucial. But some specific things that organisations have done is, if people are concerned about disclosing to their boss, which could be tricky, or to HR, who aren't unfortunately always seen as friends, some organisations have actually set up neurodiversity champions in the workplace So there is somebody that people who are concerned about these sorts of issues can go and talk to, who isn't their immediate boss, who isn't HR, but it's something that's worked very well in one or two very large and significant organisations.
Yes, that's an important point sometimes. I don't necessarily like the word champion, but it is, I think, important to have someone to one side. I
Yes,
found quite often that there is an older respected figure,
yes,
particularly in a department,
yeah,
where they're seen as being the voice of sanity. And
yes,
quite often a sensible manager, I count myself among those, of course, will sort of take the view of the person who has the overview, has the maturity, and is sufficiently respected by both parties that
yeah,
if they say, no, I think we've got a bit of a problem here, it's not if you go to HR, there's always a
yeah,
fear that it's going to be an official response or
yeah.
somehow it's going to trigger something. Whereas quite often it's a matter of almost a discreet word in the right place, I think, which also gives people a certain sense of reassurance. Would that be the
Abs-
case, Laura, in your experience?
Uh, well, certainly, actually, when I first met Vic, um, uh, the transition from Vic's early career, where it's wrong to generalize, but it was not atypical in that you went through a number of jobs, found your way into those jobs, Vic, because you are very talented and work hard, but found it very difficult to stick. Then found a first line manager in Vic's in insurance company who asked the key, what is it that you need in order to be able to do your job best? It's a very simple question, and that just opened the door to Rob Vic's burgeoning career from there.
Well,
I
it's
wouldn't
rather
be here
interesting.
today if
Sorry.
not for that. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was going to say, I wanted to emphasize as well that that line manager, as far as he knew, had never had a autistic employee before in his team or anyone with a mental health condition, as far as he knew. So he was not an expert. He didn't have all the knowledge. What he had was the right attitude. And that was
Yeah,
90% of what we needed.
yeah,
Well, it's also interesting that so much of what you're coming up with is actually fairly, don't want to use the wrong word, but fairly simple, fairly
yeah,
basic. And when you
yeah,
mention it, it sort of makes so much of common sense.
yeah,
One thing that
yeah.
slightly concerned me, you mentioned psychological safety and fears. If
Mm.
you have someone like the manager you've just mentioned who's not come across this before, what are the sort of danger signs to look out for?
I think a lot of it can be so danger signs for the neurodivergent person to look out for in a manager who might not have the right attitude. It can show quite often in that person having a very strict expectation of what productivity looks like in the workplace. There are some people, for example, who think that a hardworking, productive team is 10 people all sat at their desks from 10 to 9 in the morning till 5:30 at night, all of them very focused on the work, talking back and forth continuously to tell each other what they're doing and to check in with each other. Um, all very focused on this one thing and none of them doing anything a bit differently. But actually, sometimes the most productive office looks like a half empty one where a quarter of the people are working from home, another quarter have found themselves a quiet space somewhere in the office. One of the people who is at their desk has got their headphones on and is rocking and stimming back and forth as they're working. Because actually, that's the kind of situation where those people can do their most work. So, a line manager who has strict expectations of the external appearance of good work and good productivity that they actually emphasize over the measured output they're getting is a warning sign, I would say. And a warning sign for the line manager that a person in their employ does not feel psychologically safe. We mask a lot. We will try to do a lot to keep ourselves safe. It can become almost instinctive. For example, I can be very masked. Right now, I'm very upright. I'm making as close as I can eye contact because I'm looking at the camera. I'm not rocking. I'm not stimming. I'm speaking in a very particular way. And this is something I'll do when I'm not feeling safe. When I'm feeling secure when I'm around people I'm familiar with, my body language is completely different. So being very reserved, being very careful, being very tight to the standard social scripts and not really delving deeper beyond them, it's a very subtle thing because the whole point is that we're trying not to stand out. And I would say that if you see someone who appears to be perfect on paper, and then you see that they've gone from a high performing employee to someone who's struggling, and the reasons aren't obvious, there are always dozens of personal factors that can impact that. But one possibility is that that person has been masking for so long that they're starting to burn out from it.
And so this kind of someone who's potentially burning out, I mean, again, if you are an inexperienced manager, what would be the kind of danger signs that you would look out for in an employee who might be having trouble?
I can speak from my own personal experience. This is more than a decade ago now. So before I knew I was autistic, I ended up losing a role due to what at the time I thought was depression and anxiety that I wasn't managing well, and turned out to be, I now know, autistic burnout due to the environment I was working in. So I went from being a very high performing employee whose productivity was always very high up, very consistent. I was always very considerate of the clients I was working with, always looking ahead to their needs and anticipating those. Only taking sick leave when I really needed it because I was actually ill, to somebody who couldn't maintain a full working week in the office. My productivity plummeted. My ability to make independent decisions about a client disappeared. I used to be able to make a lot of very good decisions and go, oh, well, this client said this, but actually this piece of information suggests this is going on, and be quite analytical and deep and produce really good results. As burnout started happening, I didn't have the mental energy to use those skills. My memory got worse. My attendance got poor. And like I say, the big hitter there is I had been doing really well. And then things got worse and they just didn't get better. And we tried adjustments that you would normally try in the workplace around these things, and those didn't help because the things that were actually causing my problem weren't being addressed. So that is the sign. If there's, at the end of the day, the vast majority of people in the workplace want to do well because it's not enjoyable experience to be in the workplace and be struggling and be looked down on. So if someone is starting to show those signs where they were doing well before, something else is probably going on beyond them just not wanting to work. And that's what to look out for.
Very, very useful. Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for what is a very, very useful discussion. Let's just have a brief look now at some of the forthcoming lectures we've got coming up in the series. There we are now. Next Monday, InsurTech, how it's transforming insurance innovation. There you are, Laurie. That might be one of interest for you. 23rd of July, London Dispute Resolution. New goals for the leading city, major topic. And 24th of July, I think this is all sort of sheer chance the word neuro is cropping up at the same time. We have over 100 lectures, folks. I mean, all sorts of topics are being covered. But do look through them all. Wednesday, 24th of July, what can neuroscience tell us about leadership? Now, finally, thanks to everybody, the audience, for your interest and for supporting the Lord Mayor's lectures. And of course, thank you very much indeed to Laurie Edmonds and Vic Mazonas. Very grateful, all these insights into it's a complex issue of neurodiversity, but at the same time, the way you've explained it, there's an awful lot which verges on common sense and good practice. I think we can all think back over our working lives, plenty of examples of bad practice, and ways in which neurodiversity can be made to fit into the workplace. So very, very useful contribution, I think, to this topic. Now, for everybody, this lecture, all our lectures are recorded, posted on the Gresham Society website and on our YouTube channel, in case you'd like to revisit anything. And there will be information as well. The questions and answers come up, the discussion. And we hope to see you all again soon for another lecture in the Knowledge Mile series. And don't forget the Mayor's theme for the year, very topically, which is Connect to Prosper. Thank you and goodbye.